I have a problem. Toward the end of their banger 2023, it became clear that Nintendo's 2024 would heavily consist of remakes. Remakes of, to be fair, classic and beloved games, but remakes all the same. While I would have strongly preferred to see a higher percentage of the high-profile games being released out of Nintendo in 2024 be new and fresh ideas that have a shot of becoming beloved classics in their own right, I would be lying if I said I wasn't excited to play this new take on Paper Mario Thousand Year Door or Luigi's Mansion 2. Fast forward a bit further into 2023, and Naughty Dog revealed a remaster of their own, The Last of Us Part 2 Remastered. That did not sit well with me at all. But why didn't it sit well with me? It can't just be about my tastes in a vacuum. Despite being a mostly Nintendo guy, I actually defended and respect the original game, apart from its problematic background that shaped its message, which I wasn't aware of at the time of its original unrelated controversial launch, or even at the start of creating this video. Context to that linked in the description. I say all that to say, I don't think it's a fanboy thing. And I just told you, I'm excited for at least 2 other re-releases, albeit of varying scope, and I'm sure there will be more that I'm just as, if not more, excited for. So it's not a demanding, purely new ideas sort of thing either. And this wasn't the first time an announcement of a remake or a remaster made me feel similarly, despite the circumstances differing each time. And I'm active on the internet. I see what people are saying around times when new games are announced. I know I'm not alone in this. I think you out there watching this video right now are proof of that. So it is at the very least a valid take. However, I want to be sure that it's either a well-sourced or at least well thought out thing to have an aversion to, because especially given what I do here on YouTube, I want to try to give an effort to be fair. That's not to say I seek to like what everyone or even my viewers like. See my opinion on RPGs or the N64 for proof of that. But I do think it's important for me to be able to understand and in turn explain why I feel the way I feel on any given take on the internet. So there's a few things I wanted to do to come to that level of understanding, starting with researching the practice of remaking games itself, onto the standard scouring of the internet to figure out all we can about remakes as they exist in games today. The earliest example of this happening that I could find were arcade games being brought to the original Atari, which at first glance to me seemed more like a port, which is a whole other can of worms, but it turns out the Atari version was completely reprogrammed, allowing for better graphics and improved animations. This was the case for many of the early examples of remasters. They were really just fancy ports from arcade to Atari, or sometime after it became more commonplace for computer games to be the target for remastering projects, with a few exceptions. The most pertinent to me being Atari's Adventure, which for the time was the closest thing you get to the Final Fantasy VII remake situation. Only thing missing was the nostalgia really, which we'll get to, with the original Colossal Cave Adventure not even having any graphics to speak of. The original game was entirely text-based, but they remade it from the ground up, to put it lightly, to make it into the more modern version I'm sure most of us are familiar with today. This is the first and honestly only for quite some time example of a remake that was more than just a means to make an older game available to play on other platforms. Its primary goal was to rework an older version to better suit modern sensibilities. Fast forward a bit more and we're in the late 80s to early 90s. Gaming is officially old enough for there to be nostalgia attached to it. So we get the first wave of another popular type of remake we're really familiar with today. These days we have Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth. In those days they had Galaga 88 and Space Invaders 91. If we move forward a bit more, we get to the 16-bit era where Nintendo first enters the remake chat, outside of arcade ports of course, with the original Super Mario All-Stars, a collection of the NES Mario games remade for the SNES, a strategy that was swiftly adopted with similar collections released for Ninja Gaiden, Mega Man, Dragon Quest, amongst others. The proliferation of emulation was largely responsible for this wave as well. In fact, that's another core trend that could summarize a lot of this history. Much in the same way that nostalgia is responsible for a large percentage of remakes. Advancement in technology is the rest. I already mentioned some examples of this being responsible for the earliest remakes, but to add to the pile, we also have CD-ROM as a format, making it possible to add digitized voice acting, 3D graphics, providing an excuse to make remakes like Pong. Another surprisingly late development, considering the recurring modern day unskippable cutscene that is the worth of remakes, is budget pricing, with the first widespread example being the Sega Ages brand that started in 2003. It's almost like budget pricing is a strategy to artificially generate interest in a game people wouldn't buy otherwise, and not a goodwill favor or acknowledgement of the myth that a game released at an earlier date decreases its actual value. But that's a different topic for a different day and video. After doing all this research into the history of remakes, I wanted to get first-hand perspective because, if anything, the publicly available info that can be easily sourced is largely responsible for preconceptions I've held for a long time. To me, it seems clear that the only reason for a developer, and even more so publisher, to work on a remake or remaster would be that they are relatively easy money. And that could be for a few reasons. It may be because it's a game that source material has wildly succeeded in a prior generation and they want to further extend that success on subsequent platforms, or maybe they release a remake or remaster to coast on the overall success of a franchise without the need to create a new game from scratch. Or hopefully there's some other reason I'm not thinking of or couldn't realistically independently think of without being on the inside. To gain more perspective and hopefully arrive at a satisfying answer that's different from my cynical one, I reached out to WayForward, a studio that I felt was uniquely positioned to speak to my specific qualm as a studio that, at least from my perspective, seems to value new original projects just as much as they do remaking games from past eras in gaming. This is Adam, WayForward's head of biz dev and publishing and director of games like River City Girls, or as Nintendo fans, maybe you played Advance Wars Reboot Camp, he worked on that game as well. As a publisher, what are generally your motivations for working on a remake or remaster?
For us, there are considerations when you do a remake or a remaster in terms of sellability and sales potential.
Oh, hey, look at that merch. Oh, did I not mention that we have merch? Well, if you're asking, this video isn't sponsored or anything, but it did take a ton of time and effort to bring to life. If you want to support more projects like this and get yourself some quality apparel with well-designed Nintendo references, head to shop.watchredirect to grab yourself and/or someone you care about a shirt, a hoodie, a beanie, or all of the above. And if you want a discount on any of that, exclusive design variants, your name in the credits of every redirect video, early access before they're released here on YouTube, even input on their creation, get yourself a membership. Okay, that's enough of me. Back to Adam.
You, in many ways, already have an audience that you're reaching out to that's familiar with the other products. Of course, then it kind of can be a double-edged sword because there's going to be some expectations on what you can do with the brand and with the game as opposed to doing something completely from scratch. But I think for WayForward, at least, the primary reason why we would decide to do either a remake or a remaster is mostly just because it excites us. So, we'll do original games, but for example, when we worked on something like DuckTales Remastered or A Boy and His Blob, where we're kind of putting our spin and our update on a classic game that we liked from the 8-bit, 16-bit generations, usually that's led by just the fact that we would be really excited to work on something that inspired us when we were all younger and playing games as a kid. That really is the leading decision for doing that. And then, like I said, there's so many different pros and cons to doing something original versus doing something that's a remake and also something in between. So for example, when we've done the River City Girls series, that's based on the Kunio-kun brand, which had over 50 games before we started, but we're doing a drastically different spin on that. So that's kind of 1 foot in original games and 1 foot in remakes and remasters.
Are the motivations as a publisher different for working on it as a developer?
In the case of WayForward, since we're always the developer and sometimes the publisher, it's difficult to divorce the two. So for us, it really doesn't make much of a difference. Almost all of our decisions, again, go back first and foremost to, is this something we want to work on? Is this something that our directors and programmers and artists are excited to work on? For us, there might be a little consideration in terms of what the market wants or how much a brand is known. I would say probably more so in like the smaller productions we do. So for example, one of the games that we're working on right now is we're porting the Super Nintendo Super Famicom version of Clock Tower, which was only released in Japan to modern consoles and to Western audiences for the first time. That's one where we really wanted to look at that and say, okay, what is the audience here? How many people do want to play this game? How many people are aware of this game? But I would say that's probably just because those are kind of like the smaller bet productions. For the larger games like Shantae and River City Girls and stuff like that, it's mostly just kind of, again, chasing after what we're interested in and thinking less in terms of the market, I would say, or the primary decision to do a remake or remaster.
How does the process differ for remaking a game made by other publishers like Capcom or Nintendo versus remaking something that you guys originally worked on?
So I think that depends on the approach for the remake. So for example, with the Port Plus products, again, River City Girls 0 and now currently working on Clock Tower, these are games that are, 30 plus years old. We're not working with the original source code because in a lot of cases it just doesn't exist anymore. And for people that don't know, source code is basically what the programmers put together. If you have access to that, you have a lot more flexibility. If you don't have the source code, you basically just have the finished game that everybody has that's on the, released on the cart. So when we're doing the Port Pluses like that, we're really just taking the finished game and then kind of trying to dig into that code and change what we can, put in new languages, put in localization, get it functioning on the modern consoles. But we're very limited in that regard in terms of what we can do, just because you're not having access to the original code. You're just tinkering around in the finished product. With something that is a more ambitious remake, like a DuckTales or a Boy and His Blob or an Advance Wars or anything like that, we basically are creating those as new productions. Even though we're very carefully looking at the original level design and AI and character design and all of those different elements of it, we're essentially just making a new game with those productions, and we're doing it in new engines with new artwork. That's more similar to a brand new production for WayForward, just heavily referencing the original as we go along.
For the games that you'll go after the publisher for, is there any sort of thing that you see them do and then you're like, oh, we want to work on that game? Or was it just, man, I really like Clock Tower, I want to work on a Clock Tower game, let me see if that's possible?
It depends. So for example, with like a River City Girls, we know that brand inside out. Like, we were raised on River City Ransom, we were raised on Dodgeball, and then that universe is also blended with Double Dragon, which we were big fans of. That was one where it's just like, oh, of course we would want to work on this, the same way that we would want to work on a Mega Man game or a Zelda game. Like, that was always like near the top of our list. In the case of something like Clock Tower, even though we're aware of the brand, with the Port Plus games where we're doing more of a straight port but with additional features, we're specifically looking for what is a game that people in the US and Europe are aware of but they haven't actually gotten. So it's like, you've gotten versions of it, you've gotten the PlayStation version, you've got sequels and stuff like that, but in this case it was like, oh, the very first one was Japan specific. So that's great because all the horror fans know this series, they love this series, they never really, at least legally, got to play that original one. That's an example where we said this is a specific version that we want to go after. And then again, something like River City, Kunio-kun is just like, well, we like this series, let's do something in that playground.
While they're not exactly one-to-one with the inspiration behind this video, by design, WayForward is one of the most prominent game studios that has their hands in every part of the question at hand. They have their IP that they maintain with new releases as a developer and publisher. They actively work on reviving and revitalizing legacy IP from others ranging from the likes of Nintendo, Disney, Capcom, and more. Some of the most famous, or in some cases infamous, studios to ever do it when it comes to this topic. That said, with all of that in mind, Speaking with WayForward also achieved what I feel was a much more lofty goal from the perspective of someone that actively studies the industry from what is ultimately the outside looking in, and that's the hope that all of these remakes are pursued and greenlit for more than just money in isolation. A common sentiment amongst gamers is that the creation of remakes or remasters essentially stands in place of making new games. In your experience, has there ever been any conflicts with making new games versus settling for a remake or remaster?
It's hard to say because a lot of those decisions will happen on the side of the publisher before the opportunity comes to us. So usually when we're doing a big new game in a brand, and whether it's a brand new one or a remake, a lot of times they have that figured out before we start talking to them, because they need to go through their internal processes to get it greenlit before they actually start reaching out to developers saying, okay, now who's going to make this thing that we all agreed to make on. There are some times where there's more flexibility. So for example, with River City Girls, we reached out to ARC and we said, hey, we want to do our version of this. We want to do a new game, but we want to base it on your brand. And specifically, we want to base it on this Super Nintendo game from the early 90s. And then we gave them a bunch of concept art and said, hey, here's what it would look like. And they really liked it. So I think, there is flexibility. If the developer is going out and making the deal happen, we could have gone to Arc System Works and said, we want to do an exact remake of something. We want to do an exact sequel of something. Like, I think they would have been open to anything that we wanted. But for the major productions, usually in our experience, that's kind of figured out on the publisher side before we even start beginning to discuss that.
A benefit for consumers that we and others have mentioned in regard to remakes/remasters is they typically lower the cost of entry when compared to other legal means of playing older games. Does this impact the decision to make them for you guys?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, definitely, especially on the deals that we're putting together. Like the perfect equation is everybody knows something, everybody wants something, but it's not yet available. And so definitely in the case of River City Girls Zero, which was originally Kunio-Tachi no Banka. In the case of Clock Tower, you can see here, I literally have I'm borrowing it from our head of QA, the original Super Famicom case signed by the director. These are expensive. So it is really hard to find games from, the early 90s that are complete, that are in great condition. Even if you get them, sometimes you can play them on consoles that are not region locked. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes you need an import console. So definitely for us, it's the perfect situation for any of them, really, for the bigger remakes or even the smaller ones, is finding one where people are aware of it. People are already, excited to play it, wish they could play it, but people don't have immediate access to it. Yeah, that's definitely a big consideration for us, is having something where there's still an itch to scratch that players aren't already satiated by already having a version of something.
When approaching a remake, how hard is it to balance updated mechanics / elements of the game while still maintaining the classic charm of the game?
It's not hard. It's just you really need to give it a lot of thought. You really need to understand what you're doing, and you need to understand the audience. On something, again, like River City Girls, we are just doing a really good brawler. We've done a bunch of brawlers ourselves, both remakes and original, over the years. And so it's just about making a great brawler. On that one, we'll throw in some homage moves. We'll, say, oh, okay, well, this is an attack from Double Dragon. This is an attack from River City Ransom. And as long as we have really fun gameplay, then I think most people are going to be pretty happy with that. I would say on the other end of the spectrum is something like a DuckTales or an Advance Wars. People are going to have very strong opinions on every little thing that you would change on those. And so, especially with something like a strategy game like Advance Wars. So I think on those, we're really being much more careful to retain as much as possible and not just screw around and change things willy-nilly, because that is not what people want with those games. Very careful about what we change, very careful about what we keep, hopefully just putting them all together for what is the best experience for right now and for gamers, both that have played those games and ones that have never played them and they'll be brand new to the titles.
One thing that is a motivating factor for us to make videos is usually we see some sort of discourse and we think there's middle ground there. Again, sometimes we're guilty of the same thing. We're watching a Nintendo Direct and it's an announcement for a remake of a game that we don't care about. And it's man, well, why wasn't this a new game or whatever? What would you personally tell somebody like that is the value of remakes?
I think there's this misconception generally about oh, there's that remake, that means we don't get a new, whatever, or oh, we got a new thing, why didn't they just remake the one I made of? It's usually not that cut and dry. At least the deals that we've been a part of and that we've had come to us from major publishers, and even the ones that we put together, every game individually is put together as we want this to happen. Something to keep in mind is if you wanted a remake and you got something new, or vice versa, or you wanted them to do this series and they instead did this series, my assumption, and based on when I've worked, is they're really not holding each other up. It's just individually projects are greenlit or not greenlit. And then as far as remakes, it's just nostalgia is fun, and there's just something that is just very satisfying about experiencing something that you haven't thought about in a long time, that you haven't done in a long time, something from your childhood, something from when you were first course, getting into games, and people love playing remakes because of that. People love developing remakes because of that. At WayForward, we definitely love just looking at the games and saying, oh, like, what can we change? What can we not change? What is like the perfect version to do nowadays for the new audience? I think it's great. I love working on remakes. I love the fact that we're a combination studio of, we'll do remakes, we'll do reimaginings, we'll do remasters, and we'll do completely original efforts. And I think that's the way that we always wanted. Is I don't think we would want to do one or the other forever. I think being able to pay homage to what we were raised on, and then also be able to do our own products that show what we've learned, is sort of the perfect balance for a development studio.
And it was nice to see that Adam was upfront about the financial side of things as well. It's obvious, but all of the other reasons he gave for wanting to work on remasters would be harder to believe if the money side of things wasn't acknowledged candidly, at least in my opinion. On the topic of the other reasons, I can come clean in saying it never really occurred to me that the people working on remaking these games for these projects tend to grow up on the original. Hearing about that being the core inspiration for a lot of people that work on these games, alongside all of the other things Adam talked about, really fleshed out what I think is the solution to my problem at the start of this video. But we're not done yet. I still needed to mull this over with someone on the outside that I think is coming into it with probably the polar opposite opinion that I had. When I originally decided to make a video getting some sort of concrete answer to the value of remakes, and to further understand the complexities of how I personally feel or felt on the subject, I knew I wanted to talk to Kevin Kenson. As I'm sure a lot of you know, Kevin is a creator here on YouTube.
Hi, I'm Kevin Kenson. I run a YouTube channel primarily. I'm on a couple other places too. I do shorts and stuff on Instagram and stuff, but YouTube's really where I'm mainly focused, talking about video game stuff in general. And you can find it under Kevin Kenson, which is just my name. I am not creative with special titles.
And apart from the respect I have for him in the videos he makes as a viewer, not too long ago, I was able to develop a more personal appreciation for him as a friend. A while ago, I invited him on to talk about Live Alive, another Nintendo Switch remake I knew nothing about, as it is very outside of the type of game that I would typically have any personal interest in playing.
I lost my mind with Live Alive remake, and I'm sure there were tons of people watching that Nintendo Direct going like, what the hell even is this right now?
That was me. For what it's worth, that was me. And I wasn't mad about that one. I just didn't understand it. And I'll say that, like, talking to you about it on the podcast, Rip, was like, oh, okay, yeah, this makes sense. And that's why I was like, you make perfect sense for this video, because I think you do a good job of making it clear that you do care about not yucking other people's yum and being excited about more people having access to games that they care about, or even that you care about and want to share with people that you care about them and why you care about them, and so on and so forth. So it was refreshing to hear from him firsthand why he valued this game so much as an outsider that had no idea why they would recreate a game that even the studio didn't think was big enough to release here in America the first time. When I think remakes or remasters of classic games, I think of Kevin, as he is one of the strongest proponents of the practice I know. So here we are again in that same position. I wanted to hear from the man himself on this subject, and also get his thoughts on what WayForward had to say. Why do you care about remakes and remasters? And why should others?
The thing about remakes and remasters, right, is it's not like, there's not like a single rule, right? As far as like every remake and remaster has exactly this to offer, because it really depends on a lot of different context of like, what are we remaking or remastering? Is there a particular reason why we might be, right? Because like remaking, for instance, while I still enjoyed it, I certainly question, say, Resident Evil 4 remake again, because I can play the original in so many different ways and the original still holds up great, versus like Live Alive getting remade and then brought to the US for the first time. Like, that's mind-blowing to me, right? Because it's a very different situation. We didn't get that here originally. There were ways you could play it, but not really a way Nintendo wanted you to. Or Square Enix, for that matter. So like, the value of a remake remaster kind of depends on what's going on with that particular one, but I would say the general time where I view it as a good is either bringing something around that is no longer available, or at least very difficult to get a hold of, either because it's a game that, oh, they only made so many copies and now it's like $400 on eBay if you want to play it, or or if it's a situation where maybe there was a game that came out and it was good, it was fine, it was solid, but age is shown a little bit more. Maybe there's that right polish. I mean, a really good example of this for something that I'm looking forward to right now, and hopefully it's good, Persona 3 Reload. Persona 3 is, to this day, my favorite Persona game, and I completely acknowledge that it has not aged great in a few different ways. And to me, in my mind, before they even revealed the remake, I've always had this thought of like, oh man, if it just had like the polish that they had in 4 and 5, if they added those mechanics, gave it that, you know, awesome looking UI, but kept all the stuff that made 3, it'll be incredible. And so that's another situation where like it's trying. So yeah, it varies, but that's the biggest thing I think is either a second chance or really a first chance for some games that we couldn't play before.
Were there any like revelatory moments from the conversation I had with Adam? Because I did reach out to you to see if you wanted to ask any questions. Were there any things that I touched on that you were like, oh, good, I wanted to ask that? And were there any things that I didn't get to?
You know, the question you asked that really surprised me because it was not something I'd thought of before and I found really interesting. And I'm sure the answer also varies based on which studio you're talking to. But that kind of back end question of like, hey, is this also a useful training tool in some way? Is there like a purpose as far as, you know, training new staff or maybe how you allocate resources where, yeah, a remake makes sense because it's a great way for someone to kind of break their teeth on something a little bit before getting into a bigger project.
Does working on remaking games tend to have any long-term benefits to staff? Like something we've hypothesized for a long time is developers could potentially train up junior staff by starting them on projects recreating games as a means to reverse engineer the process, as it were. Is there any validity to that in regard to WayForward?
That's a really good question. Probably not so much in regard to remaking something, just because, again, unless we're doing just a straight port, like some of the minor kind of port plus efforts, it really is more like a brand new production. It's just, we're remaking something rather than starting with no roadmap. So I don't know if that definitely or specifically like, caters to training in, somebody who's a junior. I don't think that makes it easier. I will say that from one perspective, you have a lot of starting points. So when we do large remake productions, we don't just say, oh, the game already exists, so just start cranking out assets and code and copy it and just call it a day. Like we really do think, okay, what are we going to update? What are we going to keep the same? How do all the systems work? So it really is more like a new traditional production. However, you have more of a starting point, like I said, like you can reference back some stuff. And so I know sometimes when we're staffing, some of the people that will end up on a remake are people that were very vocal about how much they loved the original game. And I would say in almost all of our remakes and remasters that we've done, usually we'll be aware if somebody's, say, a super fan of like River City Ransom, we'll find a way to try and get them on like the next River City Girls game. And so that plays into it. But I would say in terms of efficiencies and training up juniors, it's probably more so when we work on a game that's an iterative something we've done previously. So when we worked on River City Girls 2, having already done the first game, all the systems are in place. We already know how it's supposed to play. We already know how the art style is. Those are more the opportunities, I think, that are great to throw, some additional juniors on and learn the ropes, because there's a foundation of something that we just did recently ourselves. I would say that's probably a better, use for that sort of a situation rather than a remake specifically.
Because that's even been a thing I've been thinking about a lot lately with a lot of like major AAA studios and stuff. And we've been kind of seeing how the big development cycle games, that timeline's just getting longer and longer and longer. Yeah. We're seeing like 6 years dev cycles for big titles. And it kind of brings up the importance of like, let someone make a small game, right? Like take like a part of the team and just send them over here to make this small thing in between. Like Obsidian last year had Pentiment, which I loved. To be fair, they don't really make a ton of like big polished AAA games, but they'd make what I think people would call AA, whatever that means. But that was a great example of like, oh yeah, we just took a small segment of the team and they made this other thing. And it's a noticeably smaller game, smaller budget, but it's a cool little thing we made. And I feel like remakes can potentially fill that kind of rift as well, right? Depending again too on how the remake's being handled. Building something from the ground up versus say remastering something definitely are different situations. When you're thinking about this from like a business and production standpoint, is there an extra value in there in terms of like, the resource in and then out of what you're getting as far as the game itself is.
This is another line of thought that, while based on what Adam said, it seems to be a studio by studio thing at best and pure coincidence at worst, I think could still inform why I feel the way I feel personally about remakes. Nintendo is on record saying that Metroid 2 Samus Return on 3DS led to the team behind it getting the Metroid Dread gig. More recently, the same director behind those projects used the Famicom Detective remakes on Switch to justify and facilitate the creation of Emio, the Smiling Man Famicom Detective Club. These projects, to me, prove that remakes do in fact grow franchises by way of introducing them to new audiences that previously found them to be inaccessible before. And not just inaccessible in a tangible sense. Like, yeah, old games are hard to find at reasonable prices, and that's before you even factor in the need to acquire hardware that is just as, if not more, unattainable for similar reasons. But just as important, I'd personally say even more important, to be honest, is people that aren't invested need a reason to want to care.
The impetus of this video, and this is something that happens often, where they'll announce a remake and I'll be like, why this one? You know, like
Right.
the specific one right now is The Last of Us Part 2 remastered. Like, why does that exist?
Yeah, I mean, I have my own hangups with that because I feel like that's more a branding issue than anything.
Yeah.
It's a PS5 edition. If they just called it
Right.
Last of Us Part 2 PS5 edition, no one would be having the conversation that we've been seeing around it right now, right? Because it's like Ghost of Tsushima did that and it was fine. Death Stranding did that, it was fine. Last of Us Part 2 does it, everyone loses their minds.
A lot of those examples, at least for Sony specifically, because of Xbox's approach to the same situation where they're just like, oh, you have the game, you have the console, bet you have this version of the game.
Fair.
PlayStation is trying to milk more money out of you, even if sometimes it's not rebuying the whole entire game. It's like, oh, you have the game, pay us $10, and now you have the new version of the game. You know,
Right.
When they first revealed it, and it like the assumption was like, oh, this is a $70 game, that's annoying, blah blah blah. It was like more of a problem. But even now that it's like talked off a cliff of like it's a $10 upgrade, it's what $40-$50 to buy new. That's less of a problem, but I still don't think it's not a problem.
A lot of it too comes with our definitions of like, well, the value of DLC or whatever, right? Because, you know, in the case of at least Last of Us, there is like a whole new game mode being added. With like Final Fantasy VII, when they did the PS5 version, it was also because the DLC was PS5 only, which was its own headache and weird issue because it's like, why would you make a whole storyline that I can't? Great, I bought this on PS4, I'm not upgrading it.
They put it on PlayStation Plus, and it was like, this version's not going to work with that. You got to, it's like the whole thing. On the other hand, something that I talk about a lot in defense of remakes is like, there's always one for somebody. Even if there's a remake of a game that like I don't particularly care about, and it doesn't like whatever arbitrary like lines I have in the sand for like, this game has to be 10 years old before a remake makes sense, or it's a different platform that's not easily accessible, or whatever that is, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure that there's a game that they can announce tomorrow that doesn't follow any of those parameters that I would be excited for. And the same is true for a lot of other people.
Oh, sure. Because like you like what you like, right? I mean, it's me every time. I try not to like yuck other people's yum too much, but I sometimes I have that eye roll when certain games get announced because I'm just like, man, like, you know, you're watching some major conference and it's like, now we're going to dedicate the next 10 minutes to the newest FIFA. And I'm like,
Yeah.
well, I'll go make a sandwich. Like, you guys enjoy.
Time for
I'm
Just
out.
Dance.
Yeah, it's like I don't want to yuck other people's yum, but I definitely get that reaction to where like, and that happens with remakes too, right? Like I lost my mind with Live Alive remake, and I'm sure there were tons of people watching that Nintendo Direct being like, what the hell even is this right now?
That was me.
You know?
For what it's worth, that was me. And I wasn't mad about that one. I just didn't understand it. And I'll say that like talking to you about it on the podcast, Rip, was like, oh, okay, yeah, this makes sense.
When you're thinking about this from like a business and production standpoint, I brought this game up like 4 times, but it feels like such a great example of like why did this happen? Live Alive, it didn't do well in Japan. Like the one place it released, it didn't do well, and then Square Enix was like, yeah, let's remake it, and then Nintendo's like, yeah, let's we'll pay for it to come to the US. And I'm like, I don't know who all thought this was a great investment idea, but I love them. Not that there aren't any Western companies doing remakes, but especially when we're looking at the kind of golden era SNES, PS1 to PS2 type stuff that everyone's seeing remakes of and getting excited about, it is a lot of Japanese devs, right? It's older Nintendo stuff, Capcom, Square Enix, Sega, because of the context, right? Like everything's always so different with different examples. And I think where I come from on this, and this is kind of my opinion of a lot of things, like a lot of times I'll get, like sometimes when people talk about remakes, they also talk about the way the remake should be done, right? Like, oh, well, you know, if they remake this, I mean, it's got to be HD 2D now, right? Like that's the way stuff looks, and that's cool. Or no, it's got to be a 3D. I always go back to like look, some of these ideas are cool, some of the stuff is great. I just want them to do a good job. I'm not going to try and invest any like hard belief in what the right or wrong way to do this is. I just want them to do a good job. You know, even when it comes to something like really simple remasters, right? Going back to Konami and how they've done a lot. I mean, I really feel like they actually jumped on the remaster train earlier than a lot of people during the PS3 days, because they were doing like the Metal Gear Solid collection and the Silent Hill collections. Metal Gear Solid was actually a good example of like overall a pretty solid collection. I know there's some mixed feelings about the newest one that came out, but back on the PS3, that collection that happened, there are some things that have to change with updating it to the PS3 controls and all that kind of stuff. But for the most part, it was really solid and had like a really nice UI for picking between games. And then you go to like the Silent Hill remaster, and that was a headache, because it was like, oh yeah, you can play these games, but like, oh, we made it look better by cleaning up all this dirty grime and haziness. And it's like, you mean all the stuff that was setting the tone for what made the original game cool? So it ran into those issues. And so it's sometimes, I think, hard to judge whether or not the process of remaking a thing is good, because I feel like it's always a hindsight answer of like, well, how did this particular example turn out? Because even like Resident Evil 4 remake, right? I, at least when it was announced, not saying that I was like gonna be like, oh, this is a stupid idea, they shouldn't do it, but I was like, oh, that's kind of weird. I can play Resident Evil 4 on like 18 different consoles, including the current ones, and it already has the over-the-shoulder camera playstyle that like the Resident Evil 2 and 3 remakes were adding, because those were coming back from like the tank control days with fixed cameras. So, you know, 4 remake was a really weird sell, and I still really enjoyed that remake and had a great time, so I'm not really that mad about it at this point, you know? Like, I don't have a reason to hate on it, really. It was fun. And so that's always, I think, the problem that we run into, is that it's just like, it can always be a knee-jerk thing to be like, why is this being remade, or does this one really need a remake? And then at the end of the day, you just play the final product and go, yeah, this was awesome, never mind, or ooh, yeah, ooh, I don't know if they need to do it this way.
New releases are exciting, and I want to stress this again, normal people, that includes new releases of products that existed in an older form, because one, if it's new to me, it's new. I don't care if you played it. The only time the age of source material comes into play for remakes is whether or not the sensibilities that led to the original's creation remain intact in the remake and are in line with modern sensibilities or not. And it's for that reason that the number 2 reason that re-releases matter to normal people is that the novelty of a retro era is more a bug than it is a feature more often than not. Retro gamers find technical flaws in retro games as part of the charm because they can't balance their nostalgia with thinking critically on whether or not these retro era quirks are a detriment to people without that same nostalgia. Modernizing these games in these remakes that have evergreen appeal beyond the means to an end that was their gameplay at the time is a massive point in favor of continuing this practice. And I think that is only strengthened when the possibility of expanding a given franchise is on the table. I would absolutely buy a Star Fox Assault remaster if it meant that we would see a new Star Fox game in that style. And the same is true for many, many other franchises. And even more than that, I love the wave of complete reimaginings that we've seen as of late. I mean, that brings up something interesting, I think. How do you think those type of remakes like Resident Evil or remake Final Fantasy VII, where they're kind of like flirting with new game territory, it's like a Elseworlds kind of thing of like,
sure,
this is the game that you played before, but we changed a lot of different stuff, even down to like the plot and how things play out.
Look, personally, I eat that shit up, like mess with it, because if I want to, especially in the case of something like, say, Final Fantasy, right, I can still play the original. They've ported it a bunch of times. There are ways to play and access the original, and as long as that's still kind of a rule, I'm all for something like a remake getting weird with it, especially the way that 7 does it, because I think 7 really plays with the idea of like, oh no, it is a remake. We're literally remaking where this is all going, and it's actually like a weird meta thing on the characters are remaking their story and breaking free of the canon of what happened the first time around. Like, I absolutely adore that kind of stuff. I can also understand why people get salty about it, especially in that case where it wasn't super obvious that was the direction they were going until you actually played it and went, wait, like, it's a really risky move, right? Because I could see how I'm having that moment. I'm like, this part's a little different. This part's a little different. This is more different. Like, I'm really feeling it, you know? And then I could see someone else who was like, oh, I really want like a 1-to-1, you know, this game's so important to me. I really need it. I want to see this scene, you know, recreated in modern visuals. And they go, what the hell was that? You know, like, I can totally get it. It's a risky move, and it's a move that's not for everyone, but I personally love when that happens. And again, it's kind of like what is your goal with making that new content? Is it to reintroduce just something that are you just trying to 1-to-1 bring something back, or are you trying to make something new off those old bones? And 7 Remake, I think by definition, already had to deal with that, right? Because they're being like, oh, well, we're not going to do a turn-based, we're going to make it action RPG. And so now it's already breaking those rules, you know? I feel like that was sort of of like an in for a penny, in for a pound. Resident Evil's weird because they like half do it, right? Like 4 kind of adjusted the story and readjusted things, but it more or less kind of ends the same. Like it just kind of messes with a little bit. It adjusts its own pacing. I think it worked out fine the way they did it there, but it wasn't like the 7 off the rails thing that we're seeing going on. When you're remaking a game, not just simply like, you know, improving the visuals or whatever, if you're doing an actual like ground up remake, what is that line you walk, right? Of like, what old stuff did people like that was, you know, still old and outdated, but it worked here? And what can you make new and interesting and better, even if that might, you know, slaughter some traditions or sacred cows to the previous version of the game, right? And that's a really weird line to walk. And it's almost like it comes down to, even though you are remaking a game, you have to address the same kind of questions you would be making something new, right? Ultimately, what is our goal here with what we're doing? Are we trying to just simply add polish to a thing that already works as is, or is there something that we're doing that like, where is the merit and the choice there? You know, there are certain things that I think people view as an upgrade and then others don't, and it's always a mixed thing. And sometimes you see this implemented in ways that are a little simpler, right? Like soundtracks. There'll be a lot of games where it's like, oh, we did this new orchestral recording and that's now in the game, but if you want, you can still play the old kind of approach as well. And I tend to turn the old on because I actually like how that sounds. And then other games get fancier with it, where it's like, here's, you know, you can play it where it looks like the old game, and at the press of a button it goes to the new visuals, and that obviously really requires you to remake a game in a specific way for that to work. An example I actually just had last night, and I think this is a really like kind of shows where something that I don't care about really matters to some people, and I've seen it come up a lot. I was playing Tactics Ogre Reborn, and I didn't realize this was an option. I just went to the options menu to check it out. Compared to older versions of that game, Reborn added full voice acting, and I know a lot of people where that's like a big deal. They're like, oh man, I can't play those old games with no voice acting. Like, I gotta have voice acting. I gotta hear the character speak. Like, that's a huge thing. And so it has voice acting in the remake, but then I went into the options and they're like, oh, you want to turn that off and just have like the dits and dots sounds when they talk, where it's just burp, 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 burp. And I was like, yes, I want that. Like, that feels right to me. I don't need these English accents or over the top dramatics. Just give me the dits and dots and I'm sold. Yeah. And so that's like a really good example where that choice thing, it's like, it's again, appeasing the classic fans that like a thing, but then are there choices where it opens that audience up more? Because that's a big deal for some people.
I brought up Final Fantasy a few times, and that's because that, and to a lesser extent Resident Evil, have carved out a niche within the practice of revisiting legacy titles that I think in many cases I'd even prefer over making new titles in these franchises. And that's because there's plenty of unexplored plots, themes, and gameplay concepts that can be explored in worlds that people have deep love for. And I personally would love to see what people that grew up playing these classic games would do to advance and or further flesh out the worlds they grew up immersing themselves in. And honestly, I think that right now encapsulates my distinction. It's all about what a remake tangibly does for a franchise to me. The recent deluge of Naughty Dog remasters and remakes make me feel worse because they don't feel like they are leading to anything. They don't even feel like they check off any modernization or preservation box, because it damn sure isn't difficult to acquire the originals, even on modern hardware. And because of that, instead of it being a service to people, they feel purely in service of taking advantage of that affinity for buying new releases by the company. There's nothing about the original Last of Us games that modern audiences couldn't grasp in their original form. They're not even all that different looking in the remakes than the originals. They certainly don't play much different, and of course they don't. None of them were given the opportunity to age at all before PlayStation dug up the grave for scraps. And while it's less egregious than the former examples, in my opinion, I'm not a fan of how Nintendo handled Mario Kart this generation. Like, yes, it is fair to acknowledge that they made a great game that, due to the failure of Wii U, most people can't easily experience. But as a consumer and not a corporation, I can't deny that I think just gussing that one up a bit should be enough for an entire generation, especially as someone that bought and extensively played the original less than 10 years ago. I just want there to be some semblance of reason beyond money and a vacuum for a release, no matter how old. There are plenty of games that can be revisited, and there's a ton of money to be made with them. It feels gross to me when money alone is reason enough for them to happen. And if anything, talking to Adam about what drives him and his team at WayForward to work on similar projects, as well as why Kevin is passionate about the practice in general, reaffirms how I originally felt, while also allowing for me to be able to specify and articulate the problem in a way that I couldn't before. So I want to thank them both again for helping me make this video, and I want to thank you for watching it. I mentioned it before, but quick reminder to head on over to shop.watch redirect.com for all that I mentioned in that segment, but also to access the full unedited conversations I had with Adam and Kevin. How do you feel about remakes and remasters? Are you one of the people groaning whenever another one is added to the Switch library in its last days? Let me know that and more in the comments down below. Thank you to Redirect's first ever executive producer, Trev L. Steinberg, and all of these other great names you see scrolling on the screen for keeping this channel afloat. And remember, the best way to support is to click or tap subscribe and ring the bell to be notified whenever new videos go live. Okay, that's it for me. See you in the next one.